The body hit the floor before anyone could say a word. A man lay dead in the middle of a dusty New Mexico street. Shot once. Clean through the chest. No warning. No argument the crowd could hear. Just a single crack of gunfire that split the morning wide open. And then silence. And standing over him, his hand still trembling around the grip of his revolver. He was the most respected lawman in the territory. Sheriff Harlan Cade, 61 years old, 19 years behind the badge. A man so steady in his judgments that people said he could weigh a man's soul on a scale and never once tip it wrong. The townspeople who witnessed it would spend the rest of their lives swearing they saw the same thing. But here's the part no one could explain. No one could agree on who fired first. Why, and the dead man in the street. The man with a bullet through his chest and a face the crowd did not recognize. He had been buried in a pine box 20 years before. At least, that's what everyone had been told. Before we uncover what really happened in this town, tell me in the comments, do you think the sheriff made the right decision or a deadly mistake?
Welcome to Outlaw Chronicles. This one you won't forget. Let's dig in.
New Mexico Territory, 1883. To understand this story, you have to understand the world it lived in. This was not the West of dime novels. This was not the West of painted heroes and clean gunfights at high noon. This was the West of dust and debt, of men who worked from before sunrise until well after dark and still couldn't keep their land through a bad winter, of women who buried children too young and husbands too soon and kept going anyway. Red Rock Basin was the kind of town that existed because it had to exist, because someone had to be here at this particular bend in the road to sell grain and shoe horses and patch up the wounded. The main street was a single stretch of cracked red earth running between a general store, a livery stable, two saloons, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse on Wednesdays, and a jail that sat at the far end of the block like a period at the end of a very long sentence. In summer, the heat was something you wore like a coat you couldn't take off. It curled the corners of the wanted posters nailed to the post outside the sheriff's office. It bleached the ink, faded the faces on those drawings until the men they depicted became half ghost already. But the names stayed legible. People made sure of that. If a poster started to peel, someone always nailed it back. Because in Red Rock Basin, and in most of the territory, truth be told, those names were a kind of currency. They bought you status if you were a lawman. They bought you fear if you were something else. And the name at the top of the most prominent poster outside the sheriff's office in the winter of 1882 was Jesse Ray Hollow, bank robber, horse thief, accused of 2 murders along the Pecos River, last seen heading southwest, 3 years prior, considered armed and highly dangerous. $500, dead or alive. $500 was more than most men in Red Rock Basin earned in a full year. People talked about that number the way people talk about something they're pretending not to want. But here is what made Red Rock Basin different from most frontier towns. The man who would ultimately decide Jesse Ray Hollow's fate wasn't chasing him for the money. He wasn't chasing him at all. He was waiting, without knowing it, for Hollow to come to him. Sheriff Harlan Cade. If you asked anyone in Red Rock Basin to describe him, you'd get almost identical answers, regardless of who you asked. Quiet, careful, fair. He was not a large man, not in the way frontier legends tend to be. He stood around 5 feet 10, lean in the way of a man who doesn't eat until the work is done. His hair had gone the color of winter wheat sometime in his late 40s, and he wore it cut close, same as he'd worn it for decades. His face was not what you'd call handsome, but it was trustworthy, the kind of face that made people say what they hadn't planned to say. He had a habit, when he was thinking hard about something, of turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands, as if he were reading something on the bottom of it. His deputies knew that gesture well. When the sheriff started turning his coffee cup, you did not interrupt. He had come to Red Rock Basin in 1864, a young man then, 22 years old, with nothing except a horse, a bedroll, and a reputation he was trying very hard to leave behind him. He had spent his late teens and early 20s riding with men whose names he would never say out loud again. Men who lived outside the law's reach and moved fast enough that the law never quite caught up. He had not killed anyone during those years. He wanted that to be understood. But he had been present when others did. He had helped plan things he regretted. He had looked the other way more times than he could count. When he finally walked away from that life, at 21, cold and sick and ashamed of himself, he carried the weight of it forward into everything he did afterward. The badge he eventually earned was not something he wore with pride exactly. It was something he wore with purpose. It was the shape of an apology he could never speak aloud. His wife, Clara, had known some version of this history. He had told her enough of it, in pieces over the years. She had married him anyway. She had died of fever in the summer of 1878. By 1883, Cade had been a widower for 5 years. He lived alone in a house on the eastern edge of Red Rock Basin, on a modest piece of land with a stable, 2 horses, and a dog named Copper. He had 2 deputies, a young man named Vance Pryor, eager in the way of someone who has not yet been properly scared, and an older man named Eli Suggs, who was steady as stone and said roughly 10 words a day. The town had no particular complaints about any of them. Crime in Red Rock Basin was mostly small. Drunken disputes, occasional theft, trespass arguments between neighbors. The real outlaws, the ones whose names appeared on those bleached posters, tended to pass through, not stop. Cade kept it that way through a combination of reputation and patience. He did not project menace. He projected certainty. And for 19 years, that had been enough. Right up until the night a dying man knocked on his back door, and the certainty collapsed. January 14th, 1883. The temperature had dropped below freezing 2 days earlier and hadn't moved since. The sky was a flat gray that pressed down on everything. Even the horses seemed reluctant to be outside. Cade had been up late reviewing a property dispute between 2 ranchers north of town. Dull paperwork, the most honest kind of lawman's work, when he heard it. 3 knocks, on the back door, not the front, not the door that faced the street, where a man with nothing to hide would naturally approach. The back door, the one that faced the dark, open property behind his office. Cade did not go to the door immediately. He set down his pen, checked his sidearm, moved to the window to the side first. What he saw was a figure, hunched against the cold, one hand pressed to his ribs. He could see, even in the dim light, that the man's coat was dark, with something that wasn't mud. Cade opened the back door. The man nearly fell through it. He was thin in the way of someone who hadn't eaten properly in weeks. His face was gaunt, weathered, the skin pulled tight over the bones of his jaw. His eyes, when they opened, were bright with fever. Cade caught him before he hit the floor, helped him to the chair near the small stove. Didn't say a word yet. He lit another lamp, and in the full light, he looked at the man's face. He'd been a younger man the last time Cade had seen him. 20 years had carved him differently. More lines, harder around the mouth, gray at his temples, where there hadn't been any before. But the eyes were the same. Harlan Cade knew exactly who he was looking at. He straightened slowly, walked to the window. He looked out at the empty, dark street. Then he turned back. "Jesse Ray Hollow," he said. Not a question. The man in the chair looked up at him, and he said 4 words. "I didn't do it. Cade stood very still. Then he went and got water and a clean cloth and started addressing the wound in Hollow's side. Infected, but not yet beyond saving. Because whatever happened next, a man didn't die in his chair if he could help it. While he worked, Hollow talked. And what he said changed the shape of everything. He talked for a long time. His voice was hoarse, and he had to stop often to breathe. But he talked with the focused urgency of a man who has rehearsed this conversation in his head for years, and is finally getting the chance to say it out loud. He told Cade about the night the two men died along the Pecos, a rancher named Lester Dowd and a land surveyor named Cal Merritt. Both shot. Both found the next morning by a passing freighter. Hollow had been camped approximately a quarter mile from that spot. He had heard the shots. He had been stupid enough, or unlucky enough, to investigate, and he had arrived in time to see a man he recognized walking away from the scene. Thomas Allard, owner of the largest cattle operation in the northern part of the county, member of the local business council, a man who shook hands at church on Sundays and was considered, by general consensus, to be the backbone of respectable commerce in the region. Hollow told Cade that Allard had seen him too. That Allard's expression in that moment, the split-second calculation of a man deciding what a problem is worth, was something Hollow would never forget as long as he lived. He had run. He knew how it would look. A known criminal at the scene of a double murder. He had been right to run. Within 2 weeks, every territorial lawman had his name and the murders attached to it. What Hollow hadn't known until later, until a former associate of Allard's let it slip in a card game in a saloon 4 counties away, was how completely Allard had engineered it. He had paid witnesses to confirm Hollow's presence. He had put the word in the ear of a territorial marshal he owed a favor to. He had made certain the investigation moved in the direction that suited him. And why? Because Lester Dowd and Cal Merritt had been hired by a land syndicate to survey a stretch of property along the Pecos that Allard wanted for himself. With them dead, and the blame placed elsewhere, the survey died with them. Allard purchased the land at auction 6 months later, below value, with no competing bids. Cade listened to all of this without speaking. When Hollow finished, the only sound in the office was the ticking of the small clock on the shelf and the wind working at the gaps in the window frame. Then Cade said, "That's a strong story." Hollow reached into his coat with his good hand and placed something on the desk. A letter. Folded 4 times, ye edges worn smooth from handling. Written in a careful hand Cade did not yet recognize. He unfolded it slowly, read it twice. The letter referenced a payment. Made to Jesse Ray Hollow, signed by Thomas Allard. It wasn't a confession, not in clean legal terms. But it was hush money. The language of it made that clear enough to anyone reading with careful eyes. And the date on the letter was 3 weeks after the murders. Cade set the letter down, turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. He thought about Thomas Allard's face, the man who sat 3 pews in front of him every Sunday, the man who had donated the new roof on the schoolhouse just last spring. He thought about the 2 men dead along the Pecos and the families they'd left behind. He thought about Jesse Ray Hollow, genuinely dangerous in some respects, yes, a criminal by any fair measure, but perhaps not a murderer. And then he made the decision. It was not impulsive. That was the thing people who heard about it later always struggled to understand. Harlan Cade was not an impulsive man. He thought about it for what felt like a very long time. And then he stood up, went to the supply room at the back of the jail, came out with a blanket and a jar of medicine for the wound, and he said, "There's a dugout on the far east edge of my property. You'll find it if you follow the fence line to where the creek bends. It's not been used in 2 years. There's a stove and some firewood. Keep the lamp low." Hollow stared at him. Cade picked up the letter and held it. "I'm going to look into what you've told me. I'm going to do it carefully. If you've lied to me, I haven't. If you have," Cade continued, "I will come for you myself, and I won't be in the mood to be argued with." Hollow nodded. He stood, took the blanket, and slipped out the back door into the frozen dark. Cade sat back down at his desk. He looked at the wanted poster on the wall. Jesse Ray Hollow's name, $500, and he turned his coffee cup in his hands for a very long time. The investigation Cade began that winter was unlike any he had conducted before. Every other case he'd worked in 19 years had been a matter of gathering evidence openly, asking questions directly, arresting the light of day. This was something else entirely. He could not ask about Thomas Allard without people wondering why. He could not request records without creating a paper trail. He could not push too hard on any one thread without risk of the whole thing unraveling in a direction he couldn't control. So he moved slowly, and sideways, and carefully. He started with the land records. He rode to the county seat on what he told his deputies. It was a routine administrative visit. And while he was there, he pulled the deed history on the Pecos River properties. What he found confirmed the first part of Hollow's story, and the land Allard had purchased at auction in 1880 had previously been contested. A quiet legal battle between Allard and the Eastern Syndicate that had sent Dowd and Merritt to survey it. With both men dead, the syndicate had no documentation and no representation. The dispute had collapsed. Allard had swept in. That wasn't proof of murder. But it was a motive, laid out in public records that no one had ever thought to question. Back in Red Rock Basin, Cade kept asking questions in the only way he safely could. Through the long, slow conversations that happen between men who trust each other. He found Amos Burrell, an old freighter, half-blind in one eye, mostly retired, who mentioned in passing during a conversation about something else entirely that he had seen Allard's ranch hands at the Pecos River around the time of the murders, and late at night, carrying something wrapped in canvas. Cade did not ask Amos Burrell to elaborate. Not yet. He needed to be more certain before he moved. Meanwhile, on the property east of town, Jesse Ray Hollow was staying alive and, gradually, making himself useful. Cade had expected the arrangement to last weeks, possibly a month. It lasted years. And here is where the story becomes something that defies simple categories. Hollow was not, in the abstract, a good man. He had robbed a bank. That was a fact. He had ridden with men who did worse. He had participated in crimes of opportunity when the opportunity presented itself. He would be the first to tell you that. But he was also a man who had been living in fear for 20 years, who had watched his name become a kind of cautionary tale for something he did not do, who had never been able to stop running long enough to figure out who he was when he wasn't running. On that small piece of property at the edge of Cade's land, for the first time in 2 decades, he stopped. He fixed the fence line. He kept the stable. He tended the garden in spring and summer and chopped wood through the fall. He stayed invisible during the days and worked through the dim hours before sunrise. He did not complain. He did not ask for more than was offered. He understood the terms of what Cade had given him. Not safety, exactly, but time. And he respected them. After a year, Cade brought him books. After 2 years, they ate supper together on occasion. Cade would ride out to the east property on Sunday evenings when the town was quiet. They would sit by the stove and talk. Not always about the case. Sometimes just about the land. About the weather that was coming in. About what Clara had planted in the garden before she died. This is the part of the story that never made it into any official record. The part that's only pieced together now from letters, from second-hand accounts, and from the memories of a handful of people who knew Harlan Cade well enough to understand what he was actually doing. If these are the kinds of stories you want to hear, the ones that fell between the lines of the history books, subscribe to Outlaw Chronicles. We'll be here every week, pulling something else back up from the dark. Now, let's talk about what Cade found in the 11th year, because that's when the case finally cracked open. In the spring of 1894, Cade received a letter from a man in El Paso, a former associate of Thomas Allard's, a man named Garrett Foss. Foss was dying. He knew it. Lung trouble that wasn't getting better. And he wanted to speak with someone before he went. Cade told his deputies he was visiting a sick relative. Rode to El Paso alone. What Garrett Foss told him in that dim hotel room was the missing piece. He had been present on the night of the murders. Not as a participant. He wanted that stated clearly. But he had known what Allard planned. He had known, and had said nothing. He confirmed that Thomas Allard had ordered the killings to protect the land deal. He confirmed that Hollow had been deliberately framed, that Allard had used his connections to plant the story, to redirect the investigation, yet to make certain the one witness who could contradict him was too discredited and too hunted to ever speak. Foss couldn't go to court. He was dying, and he had his own sins to account for. But he wrote it out. Had it been witnessed by the hotel manager and a local reverend, signed his name. Cade rode back to Red Rock Basin with that statement folded in his coat, feeling something he had not felt in 11 years, like the floor had finally appeared at the bottom of a very long fall. He told Hollow what he had found. He laid out the options. They could take the Foss statement to a territorial judge, request a review of the murder charges. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be clean. Hollow would have to surface, which meant Cade would have to explain why he had kept him hidden for over a decade. Or Allard could be confronted quietly, given the chance to confess or to face exposure. Hollow listened carefully, and then he asked a question that Cade hadn't anticipated. What happens to you if this comes out? Cade said he didn't see that as the primary concern. Harlan, Hollow said. First time he'd ever used Cade's given name. You've worn that badge for 20 years. You've given this town everything you had. If they find out you hid me here, it won't matter what I did or didn't do. It'll be your name on the poster. Cade didn't answer that. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. And then Thomas Allard died. Not dramatically. No confrontation, no confession. A stroke in his sleep on a Tuesday morning in October 1895. He was 67 years old. He was buried in the church cemetery with a large turnout and genuinely kind words. And the case, as Cade had understood it, collapsed. Foss was dead by then too. The statement existed, but was fragile, circumstantial, legally murky. There was no one left to prosecute. And Cade faced a version of the situation that was somehow more complicated than every version that had come before it. Because now there was no crime to solve. There was only a secret to carry, or release. He told Hollow the truth the following Sunday evening, sat across from him at the small table in the dugout, said it plainly. Allard was dead. Foss was dead. There was no one left to answer for the murders. You could leave, Cade said. Ride west. There are places where Jesse Ray Hollow means nothing, where no one would know the name. You could start clean. Hollow was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I've been thinking about leaving for 12 years, Harlan. Every winter I tell myself, next spring, I'll go. He looked out the small window at the dark property he had come to know as well as any place he'd ever been. This land knows me now, he said. I've put 12 years into it. I'll put 12 more. Cade looked at him. You understand what you're asking. I'm asking to stay put, Hollow said. Oh, same as I've been doing. Same as you've been allowing. I don't need the town. I just need this piece of ground and enough quiet to live on it. Cade was silent. Then he nodded. And 8 more years passed. 20 in total. 20 years on that property. 20 winters. 20 springs. By 1903, Jesse Ray Hollow had a small garden, a reputation among the birds and the foxes and the deer that came through the eastern property, and a life so quiet it barely left any evidence. He had become, in every meaningful sense, a man who no longer existed. Until Thomas Allard's son decided to go through his father's papers. William Allard was 32 years old in 1903. He had grown up in the shadow of his father's reputation, a reputation that was, by all public accounts, spotless. He was not a cruel young man, not particularly greedy. He was simply someone who had loved his father and believed what he'd been raised to believe. Going through the old trunks and boxes after his mother finally passed was not something he'd looked forward to. It was the kind of task you put off as long as you can, and then do in a single, long day to get it finished. Among his father's papers, he found a small bundle of letters tied with twine. He didn't recognize the handwriting. He read them carefully. They were not, as he first hoped, love letters or sentimental correspondence. They were something else. They were letters from someone who had clearly been pressing Thomas Allard for a long time. Careful, measured letters. Nothing explicit. Nothing that names the murders or names the crime. But the implication was clear enough to a man reading with fresh eyes and no investment in a particular conclusion. His father had been afraid of whoever wrote these letters. The letters were unsigned, but they were written on the official stationery of the Red Rock Basin Sheriff's Office. William Allard rode into town the next morning. He walked into the sheriff's office. Harlan Cade was 61 years old by then, still behind the same desk, still with the badge, still turning his coffee cup when he was thinking hard. William Allard set the letters on the desk and asked, quietly and carefully, whether the sheriff could explain them. Cade read each letter. He recognized them immediately. They were the letters he had sent to Thomas Allard during the investigation. Pressure, applied quietly over the years. Attempts to push Allard toward confession without revealing what he knew or how he knew it. He looked up at William Allard, and he saw in the young man's face something he had seen before. The expression of someone who does not yet know what they're really asking, but knows the answer will cost them something. "Mr. Allard," Cade said slowly, "I think you came here with more than one question. Ask me the real one." William Allard looked at him steadily. "Did my father kill those men along the Pecos?" Cade was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I believe he did." The color left William Allard's face. "And Jesse Ray Hollow?" "I believe the murder charges against him were false." Another silence. Then, William Allard, to his credit, and this would be reported later by everyone who knew him, did not argue, did not become defensive. He sat down heavily in the chair across the desk, and he put his face in his hands. Cade rode out to the east property that afternoon. He told Hollow everything, and then he did what no one expected. He handed Hollow his horse, pressed money into his hands, said, "Ride now. While there's time, I'll deal with what comes after." Hollow held the reins for a moment. He looked at Cade, the way you look at someone when you know you're not going to see them again. And then he dropped the reins. "No," he said. He handed the money back. "You've been carrying this for 20 years, Hollow said. "Wake, it's not yours to carry anymore. It never should have been." He walked to the stable, saddled his own horse, rode into Red Rock Basin, walked into the sheriff's office, sat down across from William Allard, who was still there, and said, "My name is Jesse Ray Hollow. I'll answer for what I've done, and I'll say, in front of whoever needs to hear it, what I didn't do." The trial that followed was unlike anything the territory had not been seen in recent memory. It lasted 8 days. It attracted reporters from 3 different territorial newspapers. It drew in people from county seats and distant ranches who had heard the name Jesse Ray Hollow for years and wanted to see the face behind it. What they got was not what they expected. Hollow stood in that courtroom and told the truth. All of it. The bank robbery. He had done that. He did not minimize it. The men along the Pecos. He told what he had seen, what he had known, what he had been unable to prove. The Foss statement was entered as evidence. Thin, yes, but it was something. William Allard, in an act of moral courage that many in that town would never forget, took the stand and read aloud from his father's private ledger. Payments made. To whom, and when? A record that no one had ever looked at closely before. The murder charges against Hollow were dismissed, not exonerated in full. The legal language was careful and unsatisfying in the way legal language often is, but dismissed, with the court noting that the evidence pointed toward other parties now deceased. The bank robbery conviction stood. 2 years, reduced for time and circumstances. He served it. He was released in 1905. He returned to Red Rock Basin. He walked the length of the main street on a bright October morning, and most of the town watched him do it. Some nodded. Some looked away. He went back to the East property. He lived there quietly for the rest of his life. As for Harlan Cade, he resigned his badge the morning after Hollow surrendered. He placed it on the desk without ceremony. No speech, no explanation. He simply set it down and walked out into the light. A few of his deputies tried to talk him out of it. He was not persuadable. He was charged, briefly, with obstruction. The charge did not result in a trial. The county prosecutor, a thoughtful man who read the room carefully, declined to pursue it. Some in Red Rock Basin called Cade a hero. Some called him a fool. Some called him worse. He bore all of it with the same quiet steadiness he had brought everything else. He lived on that eastern property himself, eventually. He and Hollow were neighbors for 12 years before Cade passed in the winter of 1917. He was buried in the church cemetery. His badge was never returned to his family. No one knew what happened to it. Some people said Hollow kept it. Some said Cade had thrown it in the creek. No one ever confirmed it either way. There is one question that no record, no letter, no court document, no testimony ever fully answered. On the night Jesse Ray Hollow knocked on that back door, did Harlan Cade already suspect Thomas Allard? The letters he had sent, quiet, careful, unsigned, began arriving at Allard's property within 6 weeks of that January night. 6 weeks. For a thorough man like Harlan Cade, that is not very long to build a case from scratch. Some historians who have looked at this story believe that Cade had already been watching Allard before Hollow ever arrived. That the land records, the timing of the purchase, the rumors from Amos Burrell, all of it had already been assembling itself in Cade's mind before anyone knocked on his back door. If that's true, if Cade already suspected what Hollow would confirm, then hiding Hollow wasn't a dangerous impulse based on a dying man's story. It was a calculated move by a man who already knew what he was going to find. And, if that's true, then the question of whether Harlan Cade was a lawman protecting a possibly innocent man, or a man protecting his own ongoing investigation from a complication he hadn't planned for, becomes considerably harder to answer. To this day, the people of Red Rock Basin, what few family lines trace back to that town, argue about it. Was Harlan Cade the most honest lawman who ever wore a badge in that territory? Or was he the most careful liar? And is there a version of this story where the answer is both? The Wild West was not built on simple men. It was built on men like Harlan Cade, who understood that justice and the law They are not always the same thing. Who made choices that couldn't be defended in a courtroom, but it couldn't be argued with either. It was built on men like Jesse Ray Hollow, who survived long enough to say what was true, even when no one had any reason to believe them. And it was built on the towns that held both men, Red Rock Basin, and 1,000 places like it, where the dust settled over everything eventually, and most of the truth got buried with the people who knew it. These are the stories that don't make the textbooks. These are the ones that lived in whispers and letter bundles and old court records that no one thought to look at. That's why we're here. If you want to hear more, subscribe to Outlaw Chronicles. We'll keep pulling these stories up out of the dust they were buried in. Because out here, every town has a secret. Every badge hides a story. Every legend is a man who ran out of other options. We'll see you in the next one.